المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين. أما بعد، قالوا أبا عبد الله الحسين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه: إني لم أخرج أشيرا ولا بطرا ولا مفسدا ولا ظالما، وإنما خرجت لطلب الإصلاح في أمة جدي محمد صلى الله عليه وآله. أريد أن آمر بالمعروف وأنهى عن المنكر وأسير بسيرة جدي وأبي علي بن أبي طالب صلوات على محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا أبي عبد الله الحسين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. Our discussions on the prophetic model and how this applies to the 21st century has allowed us to arrive at certain conclusions. The fundamentals of those are which? That when the Holy Prophet of Islam comes to the Arabian community, he builds a trajectory of growth. He must take his community from point A to point B, ultimately to the fore of their own completion and humanity. In doing so, in order to make this message a universal message to everybody, it must be one that appeals to everybody, irrespective of your faith, irrespective of your color, irrespective of your gender, irrespective of your ethnicity. And so the way in which the Holy Prophet of Islam was, he was someone broad enough to bring everyone together to him. And so previously, in the last couple of days, we looked at the prophetic personality. And we highlighted that the prophetic personality is not one that sends people away, but brings people to him. He is the gravitational force that brings people towards him and to that message that he seeks to deliver. And then we moved forward yesterday to talk about reformation and how ultimately, having established those principles of thought, that Rasulullah would be able to reform his community. And all of this has been juxtaposed by a very important issue, a very subtle issue. That when we say Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and his noble family in the 21st century, the reality of what we are saying is that there is an Imam of ours who is present in the 21st century. And when we speak about that mission, when we speak about the methodology, the model, the image of Rasulullah, the reality is that we are talking about the image of the awaited Savior of humanity, the Master and Lord of our age, Imam al-Mahdi Ajjalallahu Ta'ala Faraj al-Sharif. In light of this, the discussion yesterday of reformation was an introduction to the issue of reformation, something that inshallah we will conclude this evening. We stated that reformation, Islah, is something that every prophet, every messenger, every imam seeks to do in accordance with their own community, their own era. The previous prophets have highlighted that their missions have also been under the guise of reformation. For example, Shu'aib alayhi salam says, "In urid illa al-islah mastata'tu." I seek to bring about reformation as much as I am capable of doing so. And so this was the mantra of every single prophet, to reform, to correct, to better his community from where they already are to a point of their own fore and completion. In light of this, we stated that reformation of a community can take place in two ways. The first of which is very fast, almost revolutionary. By and large, when a revolution takes place, it often does not have longevity in it, or there are great teething problems at the beginning of that revolution because the movement was too quick. And so, by and large, transformation of humanity takes place in a gradual process. We have our cultures, we have our dynamics, we have our likes, we have our dislikes. And in order for us to shed our skin, in order for us to relinquish those shackles that are upon us, it is very rare that a society, that a community can do so instantaneously. They generally have to be taken on a gradual process of growth. And so the way in which Rasulullah, peace and blessings be upon him and his noble family, achieved his reformation was through that gradual 23-year process of being able to change a community stage by stage, step by step. And we stated based upon this that there were 4 or 5 principal problems or challenges of his community. The first of which was they were a community which were pagan. They had multiple deities. The second of which was that they were a community that based themselves upon their ancestral actions. The way in which their ancestors had their culture, they all followed that culture. The third in which was that they were divided into tribes and subsects and subcultures. The fourth was in which that they were very patriarchal. It was a male-dominated society. The way in which the community was so heavily male-orientated. There was a lack of rights for women, no leadership, no concept of education, no concept of inheritance. And the fifth great problem, or the fifth challenge that that community had, was that they were a community based upon fame. A person who held fame within a community, a person who held fame within a tribe, had authority within that tribe. That fame may have come from being a famous warrior on the battlefield, or it could have been for something positive, in that they may have been famed because of their generosity within a tribe, but the fame was something very clear within a community. Now, based upon these 5 generalized aspects, the challenges of the community, Rasulullah had to come and completely turn a community on its head. He had to stop them from practicing the things that had been so engendered, layered within their communities for century after century. How does a person change a community which is so engendered in century worth of action in the space of just a few years? Not even 23, but in the space of a few years. We highlighted at the beginning of this that Rasulullah divided the issues into 2. The first was in regards to shirk. The first was in regards to the multiplicity of deities. And the second is in regards to the removal of immorality and the lack of intellectualization from that community. We need to go further into these 2, and then we need to understand how this would affect us today in the 21st century. Again, based on our primary question of if Rasulullah was to come today, or thus we say the Imam of our time was to come today, how would we understand the process of liberation from within our community, the breaking of those shackles from within our communities? Going back, the issue of shirk. We stated that what is the problem with shirk? Why should it be such a big deal for a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-forgiving, all-merciful? As in, if we remove our faith bias, we pose the question, we said, "My Lord, you are such a great Lord. What difference does it make to you if I am a mushrik? So what if I believe in a partner alongside you? What difference does it make to you? Are you really going to throw me to the pits of hell on the basis of my disbelief? On the basis that I don't acknowledge you as the one sole God?" The reason as to why it is an unforgivable sin is because there is no process for growth within that mindset. The mind has been stagnated. The heart has become stagnated to a point whereby I cannot break anything into it. I am unable to move forward in my spirituality. As such, the rest of the world is moving forward. I am in my position of stagnation, and ultimately as the world moves forward, I am actually going backwards from the rest of everything else in its evolutionary process. And so if I can believe that I have created this idol, or I have created this God, or I have created this notion myself, and then worship it, this is a stagnation within spirituality, a stagnation within the mind. What is the outcome of this? If I am willing to justify that this creation of mine is God, and whatever I need to do in order to justify it, if tomorrow someone else justifies their thing in the name of their God, I will not stop to ask questions, because if I have been unable to break my own justifications, how would I stop to be able to break someone else's justifications? And so based upon that, the community unraveled. How is it intellectually? I ask you a question. You're a mother, you're a father, you've just conceived a child, you've gone through 9 months of anxiety, you've then given labor in the pain and the worry of the child, and then the father of that child can come and bury that daughter alive, and people are not questioning this. People are not standing up and saying this practice is horrid by nature. What has to happen within a society in order to justify that action? And it can only be something that has closed off the mind and closed off the heart. And that was the starting process. It was the shirk that came into the community that could justify any action in accordance with that culture, in accordance to keep that way of thinking, that way of lifestyle alive. And so, the Holy Prophet of Islam had to break that notion in order to be able to make a change elsewhere. Ultimately, this can be qualified into a specific term. Hold on to this term as we think about this in light of the 21st century. The Prophet did not just break the concept, the Prophet did not just break idols literally by saying that these idols are not really God, why are you being so stagnated in your mind and in your heart? He broke the concept of the idol that was in their hearts that created the stagnation in the first place. This is very inanimate. It doesn't matter. You can break this object like Ibrahim alayhi salam did. You can break this. But that doesn't really necessarily mean that I've broken it in here. There's a difference. Rasulullah managed to break it in here, which was the ability to change the rest of his society. He didn't just break the physical idol, he broke the idol that was within the hearts of those people. And this is something very important for us to understand. Now, when we see this, the beginning of the message of Makkah is so much based upon Tawheed, and rightly so. For example, we have that famous statement, just simple, قُولُوا لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ تُفْلِحُوا. Say La ilaha illallah and you'll be successful. This is sufficient. Do you see how basic, how elementary, how principalistic the message was? Is that sufficient for you and I today? We have created an elaborate concept, complex theology. We have a complex philosophy. We have a complex jurisprudential system with precepts of law. We have elaborate debates with various sects and with various faiths. When Rasulullah came in order to liberate that heart, the message was so simple. Just say La ilaha illallah and you will be successful. Learn how to break that idol that is stopping you, that is underpinning, that is the foundation for all your other evils. Because if you can remove that first foundation, that heart that is stagnated, that mind that is stagnated, half the battle is won in the first place. It's only until much later on do you hear from our 8th Imam, Ali ibn Musa al-Rida, when he's on that famous trip towards Khurasan, where he says, say La ilaha illallah, and then he says, I'm of the shurut of La ilaha illallah. I'm a condition of La ilaha illallah being accepted. Can you see how long it was before that message was being reiterated? The difference between the first message and the second message? The first message is so simple in order to break the stagnation from within the heart, in order to break the idol, which is the stagnation of the heart in the first place. This was so much emphasized. One of the great companions by the name of Abu Amr al-Thaqafi came towards Rasulullah and said to him, in the earliest stages, listen to these questions, how basic, how elementary the faith was at that point, how much it was about just breaking the idols that were created from within. Abu Amr asked a question, he said, Ya Rasulullah, I want to ask you about Islam, and I want an answer for you that is so sufficient. I want an answer from you that is so sufficient that I never need to ask you about Islam again. Now here, you and I, we might come with a very elaborate theology. We would start talking about the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of us might start talking about wahdatul wujud, and someone else will start talking about this concept and that concept. We have created an elaborate concept on what Islam is. Rasulullah responded with one line. He says, Islam is to affirm faith in the one God and to always remain steadfast to that one God. Simple. Can you see how simple it was to break the idols that were within that mold of stagnation that had come to within the community for so long? This is the first facet. The second facet of reformation was the moral and the intellectual reformation of the community. Obviously, this can only be done once the first facet is done, because as we said, there's a lexical order here. One needs to be able to break the intellectual, the hard-heartedness of a person that stops anything from coming in, and then you can break the immorality that is so much within them. Then you can break that intellectual stagnation that is from within them. And so, we stated yesterday a very key point that I just want to reiterate and then move on. Many a time when we try to have a reformation within the ummah, when we try to have reformation within our broader society, we are so focused on the polemics of that. We are so focused on the debates between our sects. Only a couple of days ago there was a video released of a scholar saying, if we want to defeat ISIS, and the like, we need to be able to go back to our earliest issues in order to be able to defeat that. We must focus on the differences between Khilafat and Imamat. This concept is, reformation takes place by virtue of polemics. The Imams, salamullahi alayhim ajma'een, never focused on polemics as the prime mode of reformation within their community. They looked at things through the intellect, they looked at things through morality, because that is where we all come together. And if I can make someone change in a moral way, that is enough for me, if I cannot make them come towards my particular sect. Now, on this issue, Rasulullah worked very hard in order to liberate the mind. Very hard. And this is one of the most profound facets of the history of Islam. Think about this very closely, especially tonight. How does a man liberate an entire Arabian Peninsula from the actions that they are so readily performing? The way in which he spoke to them and the way in which he planted those seeds of thought. For example, he would come to one companion and he would say, think, just ponder, just reflect. And the companion would say, okay, what happens? What next? Rasulullah would say, if you ponder for 1 hour, it is the equivalent of 7 years worth of worship. And then a few days later, Rasulullah would go to another companion and he would say, ponder, think. They would say, okay, and what? What next? Rasulullah would say, if you ponder for 1 hour, it is the equivalent of 70 years worth of worship. And then he would go to a third companion, and he would say, think and ponder, question. He would say, okay, what about? What do I do? It is if you think and you ponder, and you reflect, it will be the equivalent of 700 years worth of worship. You see, we have hadith that actually say this. One says 7, one says 70, one says 700, one says 7,000 years worth of worship. A companion came to Rasulullah and said, I'm confused, Ya Rasulullah. I've gone to all of these different companions and all of them have narrated the same narration from you, but the ending is slightly different. You always tell us to ponder, and you always tell us 1 hour's worth of pondering is the equivalent of a different outcome. Why is it a different outcome? Rasulullah said, I am encouraging them in different ways because I know that they all have different capacities from within them. And so I encourage some of them to ponder more because I want them to get a greater reward. Because when they ponder for an hour, their mind gets taken to such levels of completion. I want to encourage them to ponder and encourage them to ponder. And so I would give them a different result. For you, when you ponder, it's at 7 hours. The result is at 7 hours. When you ponder, your difference is at the level of 70 years worth of worship. What do you mean, Ya Rasulullah? Explain this further. There's a narration from Rasulullah whereby he says that the average lifespan of a person from my ummah will be between 60 and 70 years. A person from my ummah will live 70 years. Meaning 70 years in our ahadith is the equivalent of one lifespan. Rasulullah would say, when you ponder for 1 hour, it is the equivalent of 70 years worth of worship. Meaning what? When you ponder for 1 hour, the outcome is your entirety of your life has changed. You have gone from where you are to a whole new life. Your whole life has changed within the space of 1 hour. And so your entirety of your life has become worthwhile. And so if you ponder again for 1 hour, again your whole life will change. Again it is a whole nother life for you that you are living. If you ponder again, it is a whole nother 70 years. Your whole life continuously changes by virtue of just sitting and thinking and questioning and asking certain questions. For 1 hour, the equivalent of your entire life has become worthwhile. Hence, it goes from 7 years to 70 years to 700 to 7,000. I'm encouraging my community to just sit and think, because I know the outcome of that will come, that they will break those shackles that have been placed upon their minds. One day, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam sent an ambassador to one of his newly converted communities. Think about these things very carefully and how we understand them today and what we mean by the stagnation of the 21st century, how a prophet comes to liberate us today in 2014. Rasulullah sent one of his ambassadors to a community. They had converted towards Islam. And now the ambassador has to come and give direction to this community as to how they should live. Again, think about this. What did Rasulullah try to institute at the beginning? Tawheed and the thought process, the breaking of the shackles that held people back. Think about things, understand them for yourself, rationalize that bearing a daughter is not right. Being a patriarchal society and not giving women rights or slaves rights is wrong. That you've been living like this for so long, but you don't think about what you're doing. I want you to learn how to think for yourselves. How does a prophet institute this? Rasulullah sent his ambassador. Community was convert. You know what the ambassador did? The ambassador told his community, the newly convert, the small tribe, said, now I want you to dig a trench around your little town, around your little area. So all of them, this is from Rasulullah, this is the ambassador of Rasulullah. We have to do what he says. So they begin to dig a trench. They dig the trench. Then the ambassador Rasulullah says to them, fill this trench with twigs, bark and twigs, broken trees. So they gather, look how hard they're working for the messenger of Rasulullah, thinking this is what he wants from us. So he comes and they put all these twigs and the ambassador now says, light a fire. So okay, they follow instruction, they light the fire, and there's a blazing fire that is around their little town. The ambassador now says, Muhammad Rasulullah wants you to jump in. This is hadith, it's true. He says, jump in, we want all of you to jump in. That tribe is looking at each other, saying, what? Excuse me? Do what? This is what you want us to do for Rasulullah? So there's a clamor between them. One group starts saying, but no, we can't do this. This doesn't make any sense. You're telling us to jump into fire and to kill ourselves. It doesn't make sense. And the other side was saying, no, but this is what Rasulullah has demanded from us. We must go and do it. If this is what he wants, and this is how we achieve heaven, then we must do it. Thankfully, the group that said, no, don't do this, the ones that had seen sense, convinced the other group that was saying, yes, let's do this, and they didn't do it. They didn't jump into that fire. The ambassador returned and told Rasulullah what he had instructed. Rasulullah said, had those people jumped into the fire for my sake, Allah would have raised them on the day of judgment in fire, in nar as well. Because Rasulullah wanted to break their intellectual stagnation. Yesterday you were burying daughters alive. Why? Because you didn't think that it was wrong. You didn't rationalize what you were doing. Yesterday you were performing tawaf of the Kaaba naked. You didn't think about what you were doing. Yesterday you were giving no rights to your community. You didn't think about what you were doing. Rasulullah is here not to just teach you, as we would say in our language, to suck eggs. He is trying to break the intellectual stagnation that is upon you so that you can become the four of human beings that you are supposed to become. It's so simple. It's so simple. Rasulullah had to come to break that mindset that we are just following our forefathers blindly. آباءهم 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 فهم غافلون. But they're in a state of heedlessness by virtue of just following what their forefathers were saying to them. And so through these two primary aspects did that revolution, that reformation, that islah take place within the community. One, by breaking the shirk that was within them, that was the foundation to their intellectual stagnation, and then getting them to think about what they were doing so that they were ready to make that movement and accept the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, if we've understood this, it becomes a very interesting question. Well, what about us? What about us? If the awaited Savior comes, and again, he has to institute that reform, just like every prophet, every messenger, every imam aimed and sought to do. How does he do this? Now, in order for us to think about these things, we have to, again, break our biases. We have to think about things at a certain level. If anyone doesn't understand what I'm saying, then, after the discussion, after the majlis, come and we can talk about it further. Understand this from this breaking away from our intellectual stagnation perspective of where we are today. There are 7.2 billion people on this earth. And interestingly enough, the one thing that we have in common is that we all think that we're right. If you are a Hindu, you believe your system of life is right. You believe you are in sync with this universe and what your God wants from you. You dress the way He wants you to. You speak the way He wants you to. You eat the way He wants you to. If you're the Jain community, if you're a Sikh, if you're an atheist, if you're Nusayri, if you're Shia, Sunni, Wahhabi, Sufi, Jew, Christian, every person believes that their system of living is the way in which God Almighty wants from them. Now go further. That's a very broad statement, maybe a very obvious statement. We have to think about these things. Go a little bit more condensed, and then think about the Muslims. Of course, every Muslim thinks he or she is right? Just like every other sect and every other faith thinks that they are also right. But every single Muslim thinks that they're right. But more so, the way in which they justify their positions, every Muslim, every sect justifies their position by the Holy Quran, true or not? If you are ISIS, right now, God forbid, and you are beheading someone, which probably they are doing right now, if you are doing what they are doing right now, true or not, they justify themselves through the Quran. If you are Sufi, you justify yourself through the Quran. If you are Shia, Sunni, Nusayri, Akhbari, Usuli, you justify yourself through the Quran. How can that be? How can it be that every person in this world thinks that they're right, and every Muslim thinks that not only are they right, but they can justify their position by virtue of the Quran and the Sunnah? It becomes a very interesting thought process, doesn't it? That we all find justifications in our religions. We all think and prove and have proofs that my way is better than your way, and your way will be better than your way, and we go around in these circles, these never-ending circles. Now, hold on to that thought for a second. We're going to come back to it. When Rasulullah came to his community, by and large, you could divide it into 3 or 4 religions, correct? You had the pagans, who were the majority of the Arabian Peninsula. And then you had certain faiths, Christians and Jews. And of course you also had Zoroastrians. By and large, we see 3 or 4 major religions. And then as you go further, we get to the Indians, we get to Romans, and we get to the Persians. But I'm starting with just this one issue of focus on the pagans and the Ahl al-Kitab. The pagans, after a period of 23 years, had en masse converted to Islam, correct or not? Were there any pagans left in Arabian Peninsula? None. Everyone had been converted. Everyone had either died in the battlefield opposing Rasulullah, converted by virtue of their tongue and hated Rasulullah and was still munafiqeen, or they had genuinely, wholeheartedly accepted that this religion was right. There were no pagans left. However, there were still numerous Jews and Christians living within the Arabian community, true or not? Now what does that tell you? That the message, this is very important, think about this very closely. The message that Rasulullah brought to the pagan community was so acceptable that they en masse converted towards Islam. They left their paganisms. They left their burying of daughters. They left their reducing of rights. They left their tribal warfare, and they had become Muslims en masse. But the Christian and Judaic community that believed in God, believed in the previous 123,999 prophets, had books from God, had an elaborate concept of theology, had their own philosophy of living, had their own fiqh of living. Rasulullah could not convert them. Is that making sense? Have I made sense? The pagan community that had none of this theological structure, none of this concept of revelation, that were living worse than the other monotheistic communities, converted towards Islam. Yet, a prophet who was announced in the books of the Torah and the Injil, who was bringing a more elaborate concept of their own religion of Tawheed and monotheism, the same people rejected Rasulullah despite already being monotheist. Have you ever thought about that? Why? This is key. You know why? Because those previous religions, the Christians and the Jews and the Zoroastrians of that time with Rasulullah in Medina, in the Arabian Peninsula, they had become so convinced of their own truth that they were unwilling to listen to any other truth that came to them. Rasulullah managed to break that stagnation within the pagan community, but he did not manage to break it within the Ahl al-Kitab community. You see, with the pagan community, the actions were so immoral, and they justified it through the worship of an idol, and they justified it through their system of paganism. Rasulullah managed to convert 100,000 of them within the space of 23 years. Those people who believed in God, believed in Abraham, believed in Moses, believed in Jesus, had a fiqh, were following the rights of halal and haram and so on and so forth. When Rasulullah came to them, he could not convert them, despite them already believing in so much of what he already wanted to bring. Why? Why could he not bring 100,000 Jews or Christians towards the religion of Islam? What was the reason? The reason was they had become so convinced of their own faith, they had become so convinced of their own methodologies, to the exclusion of any other truth, that even if a greater truth came to them, they were willing to reject it by virtue of their own insular belief and their own insular nature. Now here I'm going to ask you a question. Very important. 21st century prophet, 21st century imam. A person stands up and he claims to be a prophet. And he says, I am your latest prophet. What will you say? You will reject him. What happens if he comes and brings proofs to you? Imagine he comes to you and says, I will split the moon. Will you not then believe? What if he says, I can raise the dead from the ground? Your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, you want to see? I raise them from the ground for you. Here they are for you. I have miracles. Will you then believe? What would take you to believe in a new prophet? What would take you to believe in a new imam? Ultimately, for you and I, it cannot just be based on miracles. 100 people can come today and break Mars in two with their finger. By God, if they do not have a system of living that makes my life better, that improves my system of living, I will still not believe in him as a prophet. Because it has to register here intellectually and here spiritually. It cannot just be about what you see at the aesthetic level. The only time when something comes to you and is proven here and is proven here, but yet you reject it, is when you have such a level of bias and enmity to that message that you're willing to close off the door and not listen towards that message. This is what happened to that Christian and to that Judaic community of the Muslim peninsula, of the Arab peninsula. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this in Surah Al-Baqarah, one of the most phenomenal verses that come to us in the Holy Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 89. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَمَّا جَاءَهُمْ كِتَابٌ مِّنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ مُصَدِّقٌ لِمَا مَعَهُمْ. And we sent to them a book. Who is them? Them is the Judaic community of the Arabian Peninsula. We sent to them a book verifying that which they had with them. وَكَانُوا مِنْ قَبْلُ يَسْتَفْتِحُونَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. And they since a long time before seek to pray for victory over those who disbelieve. You see, the Judaic community used to go to war with the pagans. And so, knowing Rasulullah was coming, knowing a man who was coming to be their prophet, they used to actually name and used to say, oh God, we are going to war with the pagans of Mecca. We ask you by that prophet that is going to come, we ask you to bring victory for us. وَكَانُوا مِنْ قَبْلُ يَسْتَفْتِحُونَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. From a long time back, you used to pray for victory over those people who disbelieved. فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُمْ And when that man, that prophet came to you, مَا عَرَفُوا كَفَرُوا بِهِ فَلَعْنَةُ اللَّهِ عَلَى الْكَافِرِينَ You did not recognize him and you belied him. You rejected Rasulullah. Think about this very carefully. What are we saying? We are saying that the Judaic community of Arabia called by name for Rasulullah. And then when he came, they rejected him. Why? مَا عَرَفُوا كَفَرُوا بِهِ You did not recognize him, you belied him. I ask you a question. Isn't there a man that you and I also call for? You see, the Judaic community knew of a man that was going to come. He was going to be their savior. That man was Rasulullah. We have a man that we believe is going to come as well. Who is he? 12th Imam. At this level, what is the difference between us and that Judaic community? They called and we called. They call and we call. They call for victory over the pagans and their enemies by virtue of Rasulullah. Do you and I also not call for victory over those who are the pagans of today and the disbelievers of today by virtue of Mahdi salamullahi alayhi? Yes or no? Can you see the point? Very interesting here, the parallel that's being made. And so, the reason as to why the Judaic community rejected him, because they didn't understand what their prophet was. They had blocked faith, genuine faith, from coming to them. They had become so stagnated that when their own prophet came to them to try to reform their society, they had been calling for him by name, begging God for him to come by name. Yet when he came, they rejected him. The reality is that if I am ill-prepared for that Imam of my time, if I don't realize what he is going to be bringing, the reforms that he is going to be bringing for me in the 21st century, if I am blocked from those very same concepts, because I cannot do anything but profess my own faith to the exclusion of everyone else, justifying it by virtue of my own justifications, justifying it by virtue of my own ahadith, justifying it by my own interpretation of the sunnah, when Mahdi salamullahi alayhi comes, he will try to bring reformation. I will reject him the same way the Jews rejected Rasulullah. It is as simple as that. And so when that 21st century prophet comes, he has to come and do exactly the same thing that Rasulullah did 1400 years ago. The first thing, he has to break the idol that is within us, that we hold to, and then he has to change the immorality within the society. The idol that was for the pagans was this. Their shirk was their own idol that they created for themselves and gave rizq to, and then said, God, please go and give me more by virtue of the gift I have given to you. The idol that had come to the Jews and the Christians was not that idol of that type. It was an idol in here that said, I know better than you. I have been following my religion, my sect, and irrespective of what comes to me from an outside agency, I block it off from coming into my ears and to my heart. When the awaited Savior of humanity comes, and he has to start his global revolution, what is the first idol that he's going to have to break? There are 1.2 billion Muslims. And there are approximately 250 million Shia. We all think we know best. We all want to justify our position by virtue of the Quran and our interpretation of the Sunnah. Our warning is that the same way Rasulullah came and was blocked by virtue of their own greed for their own truth, Mahdi salamullahi alayhi will come. His reformation, his revolution can only be stagnated by you and I, by rejecting that reformation that he wants to bring within our communities. The 21st century prophet, the Imam of our time, this will be the first thing he has to deal with. our own idols that we have made within our own hearts, the virtue, the things that we have made as to be religion when they are not really religion. When he tries to break those, how many of us will reject him the same way the Jews rejected Rasulullah? Once having broken that idol from within us, having been able to break that arrogance of I know best, and irrespective of what new version, new truth, new understanding, new interpretation comes to me, having once broken that, then the Master can come and bring about a revolution in terms of our morality. Now here we go a step further and we go deeper into this concept. This is very key for us to be able to understand. We've been saying over these last few nights certain important suppositions. And that is that by and large the community that Rasulullah came to was very similar in their culture, right? They were burying daughters alive and tribal warfare and so on and so forth. We gave the 5 earlier on again at the top of the discussion. Is the world the same way everywhere across the world today? It's not. Is Pakistan the same as Mexico? Is Iran the same as the United States of America? If you are going to revolutionize a country, every one of those countries are going to have their own standards that they are living to. They're all going to have their own thought processes, their own cultures, their own systems of governance. Some might be more ahead, might be some behind. Let me explain to you something very specific. I just want to give you 2 examples of something that's happening in Mexico at the moment. You've probably heard about this on the news, but just to reiterate and then understand this. Mexico, we are talking about a border that is how many hundreds of miles south from here? Give me an approximation. 2,000 miles? It's not the greatest of distances in the sense that it's just an imaginary line that we share, correct? It's just a line. We've just made a line and said that this is the United States of America and anything southern than that is Mexico. But there is a huge difference between the cultures, correct or not? There's a huge difference in the thought process. There's a huge difference in the standard of living. There's a huge difference in the governance. There's a huge difference in cooperation. There's a huge difference in everything that is between those 2 countries, despite there just being an imaginary line that divides the 2 of them. A couple of years ago, there is a city in Mexico that, due to drug cartels and drug warfare, this is a couple of years ago, I'm talking 3 years ago, I read this on BBC News. A city that is so overrun by drug cartels that the cartels had killed off every police officer in the entirety of that city. Now, there was one last police officer left, a female, a woman, and she had said, I'm not going to retire, I'm not going to quit, I am a police officer, it is my duty to keep this town safe. She was the only police officer. Just think about this for a moment. Downtown Cleveland or anywhere here, right? Imagine if there was only one police officer in the entirety of your city. What would it be like? How would there be, what would the crime levels be like? What would the organization be like? How would you keep away from chaos, right? That's just here. Imagine if you're a city that is so overrun by drug cartels, killings, murders, assassinations, gangs fighting each other, that there's only one police officer left. You know what happened to her? You know why this story was famous? She said, I'm going to remain. You know what happened to her? She was abducted and killed. For a period of time, that town had no police force. This is only 3 or 4 years ago. Only 3 or 4 years ago. 4 weeks ago in Mexico, as you may have heard on the news, there were 43 students that went to protest against police officers, correct or not? Yeah. According to the story that we have heard, all the news outlets are the same, they're telling us that those 43 students, they're not drug cartel, students who were protesting against police, all 43 of them were kidnapped by the police, handed over to drug cartels, and to date they still have not been found. A few days ago they found a mass grave and they thought that this was the 43 students, but it turns out according to DNA testing it isn't, according to my latest reading of this incident. Now just think about this for a second and ask you a question. Is the United States of America in the same culture as to what I've just described to you? And I'm not saying the whole of Mexico is like that, of course. I'm not tarring everybody with the same brush. I'm just asking you a general question. Is the United States the same as Mexico? But it's just a border. It's just an imaginary line that divides you. How can you not be the same? How can you not be the same? Now I ask you a question. Iran, Saudi, New Zealand, North Korea, Alaska, Venezuela, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, South Africa, are they the same? When Rasulullah came, he came to a community that was by and large the same culture. Today, when we talk about a 21st century prophet, yani the Imam of our time, and he comes, when he raises his flag of justice, is he going to treat every single part of the world exactly the same? No, he can't, can he? Because each community is at their own stage of growth, their own stage of which idols they have within themselves, which stage of morality and immorality, which stages of intellectualization they have, and which ones they do not have. It might be within this country, if Mahdi Salamullahi alayhi wants to raise the flag of his revolution, it might be the way in which he does it would be entirely different to the way in which he does it in Saudi Arabia. In fact, I can almost guarantee it would be. Now that's very important for us to recognize when we talk about the issue of Rasulullah and the 21st century Prophet. Because we are consistent in thinking that there is one world and everything has to be unanimous for everybody else. The root of religion is understanding and appreciating the differences of everybody else. The fact that we had verses differing in Mecca to verses differing in Medina proves that the way in which Rasulullah dealt with different types of people was going to be different. How is it that Mahdi Salamullahi alayhi can govern the world in exactly the same way without appreciating our own differences, our own uniquenesses across the globe, across the continents, across the borders of every single country? Now it may be an obvious point. We may say, of course, that this isn't something that's normally discussed. This isn't something that's normally intellectualized, let alone discussed from the pulpit. When we talk about the 21st century Prophet, the way in which Rasulullah would do it, and the replication of that methodology in light of the Imam of our time, the two principles of reformation will be, number one, to break the idols that are within us at the moment, the things that stagnate us, and the second will be to appreciate the relativity of all of our communities and bring us up relative to where each community may be, so that eventually the whole world comes to a point where it is united in its fore and in its completion. This is the prophetic model that we are speaking about. This is the way in which we are as human beings. This is the uniqueness of whom we are. And it makes us realize the challenge that Rasulullah had and the challenge the awaited Savior has in front of him. Again, we reiterate, it is not fairy dust that he blows on us and we all suddenly become believers. It will be as real for the Imam of our time as it will be, or as it was for the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. One Imam reformed his community through Sahifa Sajjadiyya, through the recitation of Adiyya. One reformed his community and kept it moving forward through a peace treaty. Another reformed it by having dars and classes and having thousands of students of all sects. And then there was Hussein ibn Ali, who reformed his community by giving his blood, by giving his family, by giving his companions, by giving his everything for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By God, had there been anything more that Hussein could have given in the way of Allah, he would have given it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Had there been another son, had there been another daughter, had there been another sister, had there been another drop of blood that could have been shed from him, he would have given that as well for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The same can be said of his sister Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. From the time in which Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam is born, she is born into a household of such love, but also a household of such grief. She must see the departure of her grandfather Rasulullah. She must see the departure of her mother Fatima az-Zahra. She indeed would have been in that house when the enemies of God came and attacked that door. Surely she would have been in that house when the house would have been set alight. And surely only 60 years later it would have been for her, or 50 years later rather, it would have been for her when she remembered her mother Fatima again when the tents were being ablazed. She had to be there when her father was struck upon his forehead. She had to be there when her brother Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam had to bring up parts and chunks of his own liver, in which eventually he would turn over with a stick. As her father is lying on his deathbed, Amir al-Mu'mineen brings every single one of the family members together and begins to tell them of what would occur, begins to tell them of how they will endure, and tomorrow saying, "O Zainab, you will return back to these very same streets of Kufa as a captive, whilst today you are lauded as a princess within these very same city walls." And so, Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam is the one who must endure so much on behalf of her brother. On the night of that grievous day, on that night of Sham Ghariba, she is the one who has to go out and collect the children as they are running from tent to tent in order to evade the slaps, in order to evade the sides of the spears, in order to evade the burning of the tents. And she has to go out and collect every single one of them. This grand lady of so much patience, that when the body of her brother was so broken, as she crawls towards that body and places her hand underneath that body, raising it towards the sky, her words are directed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not even complaining to her brother of the tragedy that had befallen upon her. Ilahi taqabbal min hadha al-qurban min ali Muhammad. My Lord, accept from us this small sacrifice in your way. If that was the mantra of Sayyidah Zainab, that even after having to endure the slaps upon the children, the burning cloth that she would have to endure, having to run in the darkness of the night from one area to the other, collecting the children, having to make them quiet after all their cries, if that was what Sayyidah Zainab had to endure, and yet through all of that, she only complained to Allah, she only directed her call towards Allah. By God, when she gave her 2 sons away, again she was only directing herself towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There were no tears for her own children. I cry first for Azghar. I cry first for Layla's tragedy. I cry first for Farwa's tragedy. I first cry for Kulthum's tragedy. First I cry for Ruqayya and Fatima. At the very end will I cry for myself, once I have cried on behalf of everybody else who has given sacrifices on the 10th of Muharram. And so it came to the time where all of the companions had given themselves in sacrifice, And it is now the time of the family members. Akbar is the first to go, and eventually the two young lions, these two brave lions of Sayyidah Zainab, come towards their mother. Oh, then Muhammad say towards their mother, "Oh mother, we have been longing to give our lives for the sake of our Uncle Hussein. Each time he has not allowed us. We have seen our companions go and give their lives first. Mother, we cannot stand it, but no more. Mother, not only now are the companions giving their lives for Hussein, but even the family members are giving their lives for Hussein. Oh, our cousin Akbar has gone, but we have not gone. How do we look in front of you, Mother, when we allow the sons of Hussein to go before we have gone? How do we look in front of Fatima when we are still here, but Akbar has gone already? Mother, please allow us to enter into the battlefield. By God, this was the moment that Sayyidah Zainab had been waiting for. She was so proud to be able to give on behalf of Hussein ibn Ali that she immediately took her sons towards Hussein. Oh Hussein, my brother, Akbar has departed from this world. There are others from Banu Hashim have gone. I do not have the right to stand in front of our mother Fatima Zahra whilst my sons still remain. Hussein responds by saying, "Oh Zainab, I cannot allow you to have these two young princes go out into the battlefield. What would your husband Abdullah bin Ja'far say?" She responds by saying, "My husband gave me these two as sacrifices on his behalf. He was unable to be there on the 10th of Muharram, just like we here today were unable to be there on the 10th of Muharram, but we give our sacrifices for you, O Aba Abdullah. Please take these two children on my behalf." Hussein eventually succumbs and says, "My dear sister, indeed I allow you to send these two into the battlefield." At this moment, Sayyidah Zainab, it is narrated in the Ahadith, gives them new clothes, so that they are dressed purely to go into that battlefield. She prepares them and sits down in front of them and begins to encourage them. "My two dear sons, when you go out, do not allow the thirst to come and be in your mind. Remember the thirst of your Uncle Hussein. Oh my two dear sons, do not go towards the water because Hussein is thirsty. Oh my two dear sons, attack the enemy so that we are proud of you." At this moment, it is said that she comes and embraces her two children and she gives them two swords that are special for them. I ask you, O Sayyidah Zainab, how small are children at the ages of 10 and 12 years old, yet they have to carry swords into the battlefield, yet they have to carry armory into the battlefield. At this moment, they enter into the battlefield. Hussein is standing by watching them. Where is Zainab? Is Zainab standing watching her two children? No, she's inside the tents, celebrating that her sons are going on behalf of her brother Abu Abdullah. Hussein is watching these two lions enter into the battlefield. The narrations and the narrators, the khutbah, tell us that these two brave sons stand side by side each other. Why? Because the enemies, as they are attacking these two young sons, they do not have the ability to separate them. And as much as these two are standing side by side or back to back, there is no chance of killing them. They are assisting each other, they are defending each other, and eventually the enemies come round and begin to surround them. One narration says, Umar ibn Sa'ad calls out, "By God, how much Zainab must love her brother in order to send her two young children into the battlefield." Oh, Ibn Sa'ad, you do not know the love that we have for Hussein ibn Ali. You do not understand what it is to sacrifice in the way of Hussein. These two young sons stand beside each other and they begin to fight and they begin to send enemies towards the pitfalls of hell. Eventually, there is a cry from the battlefield, "O army of Ja'far ibn Sa'ad, you will not be able to defeat these two young moons unless you divide them, separate them. And so the enemies begin to charge at them with horses, separating these two young children from each other. Imagine a 10-year-old, he is separated from his brother. Any brother who is separated from his brother will know what it's like to be separated. But to have a 10-year-old separated from his 12-year-old, you can imagine that Muhammad must have been calling out, "Oh, where are you? The dust of Karbala is so much. The horses' hooves are dividing us. Call out for me, brother, so I can come and find you." But whilst they are separated, the enemies begin to surround them. They begin to strike them with swords and with spears. Zainab is still sitting inside that tent, so proudly waiting to hear news of the martyrdom of her two sons. At this moment, they begin to strike these two lions with swords. The first to fall towards the floor is Muhammad. He calls out for his brother. "Oh Muhammad," he calls out for his brother. Own, come to my aid." Own turns towards his brother and rushes towards him and sits down beside his stricken brother. Whilst he is there, the enemies begin to attack Own. They begin to surround Own and they begin to strike him as well. He falls towards the ground. He calls out, "Ya Aba Abdillah, alaykum minni salam, accept my salutation." At this moment, the women begin to come out of their tents. "Wa Muhammada, wa una." They begin to cry and to try to come towards Sayyida Zainab. Zainab is still sitting inside that tent, not worrying about anything other than her brother Abu Abdullah. Hussein rushes in towards the battlefield. He sits down between these two brothers and watches their souls depart towards their grandmother Fatima Zahra. At this point, he picks up the two bodies. The hadith specifically says, as he brings these two bodies, their feet are dragging along the plains of Karbala. They are brought back towards the tent. All the ladies rush out to begin to come and sit beside these two broken bodies. Again, Sayyida Zainab is sitting inside her tent. The narration tells us that it was only until after she returns back towards the city of Medina. She comes back towards Medina, and as she does so, all of the family members come out to greet the black flags, to greet the grief-stricken family of Banu Hashim. At this moment, Abdullah ibn Ja'far comes towards Sayyida Zainab. "What is the news? Tell me what has happened to Abbas. Tell me what has happened to Akbar." The same way, we do not want to know what has happened to our children. Our concern is with Hussein and Abbas and Akbar. Tell us what has happened to Ruqayya in Damascus. At this moment, she comes back into her house. It is said by Al-Khutaba that there is a room inside her house, and inside that house there are two small prayer mats. They are two very small prayer mats that were kept specially for her two sons, Own and Muhammad. It is only upon seeing these two that she begins to cry for the sake of her two sons. "Oh Own and oh Muhammad, you have done me so proud. Zainab is so proud of you today. We say to you now, oh Zainab, if you did not cry for Own and Muhammad, we will cry for Own and Muhammad. We will be the ones to remember the sacrifices of Own and Muhammad before Abu Abdullah." ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون وقاتلا في سبيلك فوفق لنا ماتم الحسين يا حسين
Ya Hussein, 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 Hussein, Ya 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 Hussein. Hai o Muhammad, hai mere o Muhammad, hai o Muhammad, hai mere o Muhammad, hai o Muhammad, hai mere o Muhammad, hai o Muhammad, hai mere o Muhammad. बैठी हुई ज़मीं पर, हाय बैठी हुई ज़मीं पर, कहती थी रो के ज़ैनब, हाय ओ मोहम्मद, हाय मेरे ओ मोहम्मद, हाय ओ मोहम्मद, हाय मेरे ओ मोहम्मद। बैठी हुई ज़मीं पर, कहती थी रो के ज़ैनब, हाय ओ मोहम्मद, हाय मेरे ओ मोहम्मद, हाय ओ मोहम्मद, हाय मेरे ओ मोहम्मद। कम सिन थे तुमने फिर भी ऐसी लड़ी लड़ाई, देते थे दाद तुमको शह के दिलेर भाई। मैदान में उठ रहा था एक शोर मरहबा का, मैदान में उठ रहा था एक शोर मरहबा का। बैठी हुई ज़मीं पर, कहती थी रो के ज़ैनब, हाय ओ मोहम्मद, हाय मेरे ओ मोहम्मद, हाय ओ मोहम्मद, हाय मेरे ओ मोहम्मद, हाय ओ मोहम्मद, हाय मेरे ओ मोहम्मद। तुमने ये तरबियत का एजाज भी दिखाया, दी अपनी जान लेकिन इस्लाम को बचाया। ये सीने जान सारी बच्चों में तुम पे वारी, ये सीने जान सारी बच्चों में तुम पे वारी। बैठी हुई ज़मीं पर, कहती थी रो के ज़ैनब, हाय ओ मोहम्मद, हाय मेरे ओ मोहम्मद, हाय